My name is Tekliagos, I'm 43 years old, and the story I want to share with you today is how God saved me from certain death in Eritrea. For 15 years, I pastored in the most dangerous regions of the Horn of Africa, but I never imagined that one day I would be trapped inside a metal container under the scorching sun, my lips cracked from thirst and my body so weakened I could barely stand. There, it seemed like I was about to breathe my last. But even in that moment of utter despair, God manifested himself in a way so powerful that it defied all human understanding. What happened that night of July 17, 2012, in a clandestine detention camp on the outskirts of Asmara, the capital of Eritrea? This is something science cannot explain, logic cannot grasp, and even our most trained minds can barely process. Are you ready to hear how a simple song of praise amidst the deepest darkness was able to perform a miracle that shook the foundations of religious persecution in Eritrea? If this story touches your heart, like this video and share it so more people can hear what God still does, even in places close to the gospel. My journey began in January 2012. I was in my small church in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, a simple but vibrant congregation. I had been pastoring there for 7 years, witnessing how God transformed people's lives and restored families. My wife Selam and I lived a quiet life with our 3 children, David 12, Eden 9, and little Samuel just 4. We had a simple but welcoming home, a fruitful ministry, and a community that loved us deeply. But God had different plans for us. On the morning of January 3rd, 2012, while praying in my office, I had a vision that changed my entire life. It wasn't a dream, nor just a passing thought. It was a clear, vivid vision, so real that for a moment I thought I had been physically transported to another place. I saw faces, hundreds of faces of Eritrean brothers and sisters, weeping silently, praying secretly, huddled in damp basements or dark rooms, their windows closed to prevent the light from betraying them to persecution. Their faces were etched with fear, but also with unbreakable determination. Then the vision transformed. I saw metal containers lined up under the blazing sun. The heat was so intense it seemed the containers were about to melt. Inside I could hear muffled wails, the voices of Christians in pain. I felt their pain as if it were my own. And then, like a thunderclap in my spirit, I heard the voice of the Lord. Tap. My children are suffering on the other side of the border. Go and strengthen them before their faith fades. Be strong and courageous, for I will be with you wherever you go. I fell to my knees trembling. It wasn't the first time God had spoken to me during prayer, but never with such clarity, such urgency. Eritrea, Lord? I asked, even though I knew he had spoken directly to my heart. But why me? Why now? My spirit was filled with doubt and fear, but I knew I couldn't ignore the call. When I returned home that morning and told Selam about the vision, she collapsed on the floor of our small kitchen as if her legs had lost all strength. Her tears formed in puddles on the cement floor as she begged me, Tekle, please don't go to Eritrea. Do you know what's happening there? The government is arresting all Christians who don't belong to the churches they control. I can't lose you, not now. Selam's fear was real. I knew the risk I was taking, but there was something stronger within me, something that pushed me to obey God's call, even if the cost was high. I didn't know exactly what awaited me, but I felt that the mission was more important than any fear or personal concern. This decision led me down a dangerous and tortuous path, and it wasn't long before I was captured. I was forcibly taken to that detention camp where for days on end I lived through hell. But even there, amidst the pain and suffering, I knew that God was with me. He never abandoned me. And it was in that moment of despair, when it seemed all was lost, that God manifested his power in an indescribable way, transforming death into life and pain into victory. The words of my friend and mentor, Pastor Tesfaye, struck me like a sharp blade. He looked me in the eye with a sincerity only someone who has experienced many battles can possess. Tekle, the authorities are locking pastors in metal containers under the scorching sun until they renounce their faith, or else they simply disappear. They will no longer be among us. Think of your children. Do you want them to grow up without a father? Don't judge the consequences on impulse. This is no small decision. The weight of his words was crushing. He was right. I had every reason to fear. Since 2002, the government of Isaias Afwerki, who had led Eritrea's fight for independence and become its first president, had intensified persecution against Christians, especially evangelicals, Pentecostals, and members of unregistered churches. The Orthodox, Catholic, and Lutheran churches were the only ones legally recognized. Any other expression of the Christian faith was seen as illegal, a threat to national security. The situation was becoming untenable. The news coming across the border through refugees who managed to escape to Ethiopia was terrifying. Pastors were imprisoned without trial, others tortured until they lost their faith, and many simply disappeared, as if they had never existed. Eritrea had become one of the most repressive regimes in the world, especially for Christians. Mandatory and indefinite military service became a form of forced labor that lasted decades. Freedom of expression was non-existent. There were no opposition political parties or independent civil organizations. The country had become a vast prison, where fear and distrust lurked around every corner, and families could not even speak freely within their own homes. And I was about to cross that invisible line, risking myself in a territory where Christian life became a crime. Even in the face of all this, I felt a calling in my heart, something pushing me into Eritrea to minister to the underground churches. I spent the next 3 weeks in prayer and fasting, asking God to give me confirmation, or perhaps an alternative, so that He would change His mind. But the more I prayed, the clearer, more audible, and more irresistible the call became. That's when Pastor Tesfale came to visit me. He had learned of my plans from Selam, who, desperate, had sought him out, hoping he would convince me to give up. He was already advanced in years, his white hair and stooped posture revealing decades of ministry under extreme conditions. But still he came. He sat with me under the mango tree, on the same bench where I had counseled so many members of our church over the years. The afternoon sun illuminated his face, and when he began to speak, the words came out heavy, as if carrying the weight of his entire life experience. Tekle, last year, 3 of my students crossed the border into Eritrea to strengthen the underground churches. They were young people full of faith, convinced that God had called them just like you now. None of them returned. We don't even know if they're still alive. He paused, and I could see the pain in his eyes, a pain that didn't fade with time. I'm not here to stop you, son. If God called you, no one can stand in your way. But I need to be sure you understand what you're doing. The price will not be yours alone, but that of your wife, Selam, and your children. They will pay too. Those words cut me to the core. I knew deep down he was right. He was warning me not to deter me, but to make me understand the seriousness of the decision. I knew my life would never be the same again, that nothing would be the same again. But the more people tried to dissuade me, the stronger God's call within me became. I couldn't deny it, even if it meant losing everything, even my life. It was the price of obedience. I was willing to pay it because I knew God was with me. And deep down, I also knew He would be with every Christian in every dark corner of Eritrea, in the detention camps, in the underground churches. I was not alone. It was like a fire burning in my bones, something I couldn't contain. I remembered the words of Jeremiah 29. If I say, I will not make mention of Him or speak any more in His name, it is in my heart like a burning fire burning in my bones. I tried to endure it, but I couldn't. I tried to resist. I looked for a way to ignore it, but I couldn't. I knew the call was from God, and how could I disobey Him? Wouldn't it be even more serious to ignore His voice? I understand, Father, I replied, with the humility I always had when addressing Him. This old pastor who welcomed me at 16 when my life was lost in a whirlwind of uncertainty. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and pride. His look said it all, but with his wisdom and experience, he simply nodded slowly. In that case, at least let me help you prepare as best I can. And so I began to prepare. Over the next month, I immersed myself in intensive studies of Eritrean, a language related to Tigrinya, which I already spoke, but with significant differences. I memorized entire passages of the Bible, knowing I couldn't take one with me. I spent hours secretly meeting with Eritrean refugees in Addis Ababa, listening to their stories and trying to understand more about the situation on that side of the border. Pastor Tesfale, ever so careful, connected me to a discreet network of Christians who were undercover, maintaining contact with the underground churches in Eritrea. It was through them that I met Jale, a man in his early 40s who had escaped from Eritrea 3 months earlier. He had been imprisoned for 2 years for his faith. The scars on his wrists and ankles spoke of the suffering he had endured. With trembling hands, he handed me a rudimentary map drawn on a piece of cloth, safer than paper because it could be sewn into my clothes without risk of being found. If you go, Brother Tekle, Jale said, his voice breaking, know that you may not return. But if God has called you, He will be with you as He was with Daniel in the lion's den. That phrase remained engraved in my heart. As he spoke, I felt the responsibility of carrying out this mission. The risk was great, but I knew that God was with me, just as He had been with the martyrs, the prophets, and all those who had obeyed before me, even without knowing what awaited them. Amidst this preparation, Selam vacillated between moments of uncontrollable weeping and others of quiet resignation. She had never before displayed such profound fear. But one night, I found her in our room, on her knees, praying with an intensity I'd never seen in her before. As I knelt beside her, she said, her voice breaking, I'm not asking Him to stop you from going, Tekle. I only ask that He protect you and bring you back to us. And if that is not His plan, I ask for the strength to accept His will. Her faith in that moment humbled me deeply. I was trying to obey God, but Selam was being called to an even more difficult obedience, to surrender her husband to a mission from which she knew she might not return. The day arrived. It was February 15, 2012, the day to leave. We gathered for a final family prayer. Samuel, my little 4-year-old, clung to my legs, crying desperately, "Daddy, don't go, I'm scared. Who will read me bedtime stories?" My heart sank as if everything inside me wanted to stay there, with him, with all of them. But Eden, my 9-year-old daughter, always brave despite her young age, tried to calm him. "Daddy will tell stories about Jesus to the children who don't know them. Remember? Like the doctor who will heal the sick in other villages." She was trying to be strong, but I could see the fear in her eyes. David, my firstborn, stood beside Selam, trying to contain his emotions. At 12, he already understood what my departure meant. He understood the cost of the mission. I looked at him and saw there a reflection of myself, of my inner struggle. He was also afraid, but he knew my heart was at peace. I looked at each of them, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the power of God's promise. I was leaving on a mission that only He could sustain me. And so, with a broken heart, with a mix of pain and hope, I said goodbye to my family, knowing that every step I took was a step toward fulfilling God's calling, a calling I could not ignore, no matter the cost. He looked me in the eyes with a maturity that surprised me. "We'll pray every day, Dad, at the same time at 9 p.m. "We won't forget," David said, trying to hide the fear in his voice, but I could hear the pain he felt. He was only 12, but there in that moment he seemed so much older, so much wiser than I. With a tightness in my chest, I thanked God for giving me such strong, understanding children. Selam was the last to say goodbye. She hugged me with silent intensity, as if trying to imbue me with all her love, all her strength for the months to come. It was as if through that embrace, she wanted to protect me from everything I would face on the other side of the border. And whispering in my ear, Tekel said, "Please come back to us." I looked at her, speechless, but with a heavy heart. "If God decides otherwise," I replied, "we will meet again in glory." With those words echoing in my heart, I knew I couldn't look back. If I did, my resolve, my commitment would crumble. I took a deep breath, took my last step into the unknown, and continued on. The frontier was before me, and I was about to cross it, but fear, doubt, everything that tied me to the life I was leaving behind was there, trying to make me hesitate. But the call was stronger. I had to go. I crossed the border on foot, passing through a blind spot in the mountains, a passage known to smugglers and conscript refugees. The refugees had given me directions, but I knew this path was risky. It was an area sporadically guarded by border patrols. I spent hours hiding, waiting for the right moment to move on. My guide, a young Eritrean named Mesfin, who charged a considerable fee for his service, gave me the signal to move on. For the next 2 days and nights, I walked through the arid landscape, hiding from patrols, sleeping in caves and under thorn bushes. The heat was unbearable, and thirst consumed me, but there was no time to stop. With each step, the terrain seemed more treacherous. Barren mountains, deep valleys, trails that appeared and disappeared among the dry vegetation. Several times we had to crouch and remain completely still, our hearts racing as soldiers passed just meters from where we were hiding. Every sound, every movement seemed amplified in that oppressive silence. The feeling of being hunted never left me. Our destination was Mendefera, a city south of Asmara, where I would meet a contact named Jonas. He had been recommended to me as someone who could guide me to fellow believers, but the risk of detection was imminent. Mesfin took me to the outskirts of the city and gave me precise instructions. I was to wait until 3 p.m., order a cardamom coffee, and sit at a secluded table. When Jonas saw me, he would know who I was by the scar on my right cheek, a childhood mark. With growing nervousness, I made my way to the cafe, aware that my mission was just beginning. When I arrived and began walking through the city, a palpable tension filled the air. It wasn't just my fear and caution. It was a collective feeling, something that permeated the entire society. The military checkpoints on the roads, the suspicious glances between people, the sudden silence when a stranger passed by, all of this indicated that I was in a place where fear ruled every corner, where vigilance was in every gaze. It wasn't just my safety that was at stake. It was that of all who risked living their faith in a country where even the simplest expression of freedom was persecuted. Jonas showed up at the appointed time. He was a young man of 26, thin as a reed, with eyes that seemed constantly alert, always scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. He sat down across from me in the cafe, and with a discreet movement began speaking in a low voice, as if our conversation were a clandestine operation. "Pastor," he said, "it's a miracle you made it this far. I'll take you to the brothers, but know that every step we take is watched. Neighbors spy on neighbors. Co-workers inform on each other." He paused as if weighing the weight of his own words and continued, "There are even children who, after being indoctrinated in schools, betray their own parents." This left me speechless. Fear was everywhere and no one was immune. "Don't trust anyone you haven't personally introduced yourself to. he warned. I felt the truth of every word. Trust was a luxury, a remote possibility. Jonas led me through narrow, dusty alleys to a small, inconspicuous house on the outskirts of Mendefera. Each step brought me closer to the beating heart of the underground church, but at the same time, each step took me further away from safety, from the life I had left behind. I didn't know what awaited me, but one thing was certain. I was at the center of God's will, and even with all the fear that consumed me, I knew He was with me. There, Jonas introduced me to an elderly woman named Ruth. She was over 70, but an inner strength that transcended her years was reflected in her eyes, still lively and full of faith. Ruth was a widow, and her husband had disappeared 5 years ago, likely taken by the authorities because of his faith. She, for her part, had not let grief and loss break her. With quiet determination, she used her home as a secret meeting place for the underground church. "Welcome, Pastor Tekel," she said, taking my hands in hers, which were rough and calloused from a lifetime of hard work. "We've been praying for you since we knew you were coming. God has heard our prayers." Hearing this, I felt the full weight of the mission intensify. I was no longer alone. I was now part of something much greater. God's people, in their faithfulness, awaited me as if I were a light at the end of a tunnel of darkness. Over the next few weeks, my journey took me from Mendefera to Kemer and finally to Asmara. I never stayed in one place for more than 3 days. Each new address was merely a temporary respite, always in fear of discovery, of betrayal. The protocol of the underground church demanded this: invisibility. The cautious and disciplined believers became masters of the art of concealment. The meetings mostly took place at night, in rooms with the windows sealed with thick blankets to ensure no ray of light would betray our presence. At each meeting, small groups of 5 to 7 believers arrived at different times, never together. There was always a gap of hours between meetings to avoid suspicion. It was a survival dynamic where the fear of being betrayed hung over our heads like a sharp sword. But what touched me most was the spirit of these brothers and sisters, a deep thirst for the Word of God. I clearly remember Senait, a young 22-year-old teacher. She was fired from her job after a small wooden cross was discovered among her belongings at the school where she taught. Now she survived by giving clandestine private lessons, always afraid of being reported by one of her students or their parents. "Pastor Tekle," she said on a quiet night, her eyes shining with emotion as she squeezed my hands. "It's been 14 months since I've heard a complete biblical teaching. We have our meetings, but they're so quick, so tense, always with one eye on the door. Every word you share is like water in the desert for my soul." Senait's words resonated deeply with me. They made me realize that although I was the pastor from the outside, I was also being spiritually nourished by them. And it wasn't just Senait. I also remember Verhane, a 70-year-old man, a former deacon of a Pentecostal church that was closed by the regime in 2002. Verhan had been arrested for refusing to sign a document renouncing his faith. He spent 8 months in one of the infamous metal containers, constantly tortured, but he survived. His health was severely affected. He could barely walk without support. But whenever a meeting was organized in Asmara, Verhane would do whatever it took to be there. Sometimes he would walk for more than an hour, dragging his weakened body just to be with us to hear the word of God and pray with the brothers. "I survived," he told me one night, squeezing my hand with his bony fingers and silently crying. "What they don't understand is that they can lock up our bodies, but our spirits fly free with Christ every day in that metal furnace." When I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I closed my eyes and saw myself flying over the mountains, beyond the borders, straight into the arms of Jesus. "They can't imprison this, Pastor. They can't kill this." Verhane's words resonated in my heart and mind for a long time. The man who, despite the physical and emotional pain, could still see the freedom that no one could take from him. This gave me strength when I felt myself on the brink of despair, when the pressure of constantly living under the risk of arrest or denunciation seemed unbearable. In these clandestine meetings, we prayed in barely audible whispers. We sang so softly that sometimes we could only see our lips moving, but no sound came out. We studied the Bible with an intensity and zeal I had never experienced in Ethiopia, where we could worship freely. These brothers and sisters lacked freedom, but they possessed a spiritual richness that deeply impressed me. They were willing to lose everything, even their lives, for their faith. In their struggle, I found myself closer to God than I had ever been before. What they had in abundance was something I had been missing in my own life: an unshakable trust in God's presence, a faith that could not be shaken by circumstances. The faith of those brothers and sisters was not theoretical, not a faith of fine words or comforting books. It was a faith forged in the fires of daily persecution, tempered by constant sacrifice. It was a faith that remained alive amidst a hell of suffering and fear. It shone like diamonds, those diamonds that form under the immense pressure of the earth, in an invisible and painful process, but which results in something pure, resilient, and immortal. I realized with each passing day that I wasn't there just to strengthen those believers. They were in fact strengthening me. They showed me a dimension of faith I had never fully experienced, despite my years of ministry and the experience I thought I had accumulated. I, who had always thought of myself as the one providing support, found myself being nourished by their lives. With each encounter, with each whispered prayer, with each shared word, I felt a renewal of spirit, a clarity I'd never experienced, even in my best days of faith. Over time, the groups began to grow a little more. Their faith, like fire, did not die out but spread. Believers who had previously been alone, isolated, and unsure of whom to trust began to connect. Other believers thirsty for teaching and encouragement were carefully brought into these secret meetings. New converts, who came from a background marked by fear and doubt, began to be discipled, while young people struggled with the difficulties of believing in an environment hostile to faith. Within 6 weeks, I had connected with over 120 Christians organized into different prayer cells in Asmara and neighboring cities. We established a communication system that resembled a shadow game, simple codes and reliable messengers, most of whom were people already willing to pay the price for their faith. They helped us coordinate meetings and warn us of potential dangers. We also began organizing mutual aid initiatives, such as a fund for families whose breadwinners had been arrested and a system to provide food for elderly Christians who had been rejected by their families because of their faith. We created underground classes for children who had been expelled from schools because they were children of believers. But despite all the good things that were happening, there was a constant shadow of danger. It was a time of extraordinary spiritual growth, but also of constant vigilance and fear. We knew that at any moment, any movement could mean one of us would be exposed, and that meant arrest, torture, or even death. There were several times when we had to cancel meetings at the last minute. Someone had somehow noticed something suspicious in the neighborhood. Once, we were in the middle of a Bible study at a house when our host's young son, just 8 years old, ran up to us and whispered in rapid whispers that a military vehicle had parked on the street. We acted quickly. We slipped out the back door and scattered in different directions while the family pretended to be celebrating a birthday with a specially baked cake as a smokescreen to cover our gathering. But the weight of clandestine life hit us hardest on one particularly difficult night. After an intense meeting where 3 young people renewed their commitment to Christ, I returned to the house where I was temporarily staying. Jonas was waiting for me at the door, and something in his face, normally cheerful and full of hope, was now dark, like a storm cloud heralding imminent danger. "Pastor," he said in a trembling voice, quickly pulling me inside and closing the door behind him. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. They arrested Mebratu and his entire family. Someone must have ratted us out. The silence that followed was heavy, as if the air around us had become thick and difficult to breathe. Mebratu was one of our most faithful hosts. He was a humble man, married with 2 teenage daughters. 3 days earlier, he had opened his home for a gathering where 15 believers could receive teaching and encouragement. Now the news was that he and his family had been taken. "When did this happen?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. Jonas replied, his voice breaking. "Last night, after midnight. They came with 2 military trucks and surrounded the house. A neighbor who sympathized with us saw everything. They took the 4 of them away, handcuffed, even the girls. We don't know where they were taken, but probably to Merwa or the underground prison in Keleli. Both places are known to be the worst detention camps. I knew Marwa was an infamous detention camp where conditions were indescribable. The terrifying sound of screams and moans coming from the metal containers had become a legend of terror among Eritreans. I also knew that Keleli was a place where prisoners were simply erased, disappearing without a trace, many of them dying under torture or from unknown causes. Jonas's words sounded like a death sentence to Mebratu and his family, but it was more than that. The threat was now closer to home. The risk had become personal. The pain of uncertainty and helplessness gripped me, but at the same time my faith grew stronger in the face of the brutal reality of the suffering I was witnessing. How could I be discouraged by brothers like Mebratu, who were willing to pay the price, knowing what it meant? And more than that, how could I abandon this mission, knowing that the need for Christ in Eritrea was greater than ever? Keleli prison was known as one of the most feared places in Eritrea. Underground, dark and cut off from the outside world, many disappeared without a trace, and the few who did leave bore scars that would never fade. "Do you think they'll mention my name during the interrogation?" I asked Jonas, doubt gnawing at me. The question was out of me before I could think about what I was saying. I immediately hated myself for worrying about my own safety first, when Mebratu and his family were in their hands. But Jonas didn't need to answer. We both knew that in a place like that, it would only be a matter of time before my presence was discovered. And under the pressure of the torture that took place there, no one could be blamed for betraying anyone. "We need to get you out of Asmara as quickly as possible," Jonas said, his hand shaking as he tried to smooth his hair, a desperate attempt to hide the fear that was shining in his eyes. Tomorrow before dawn, we'll take you to Massawa. From there, we'll try to find a route to Sudan. Massawa, Eritrea's main port on the Red Sea, was a safe haven for those willing to risk their lives. But controls were intense. Escape wouldn't be easy. I will pray for them, for Mebratu and his family, for all of us, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was breaking. Jonas just nodded, his face a mix of fear and determination. Be at peace, Pastor, he said, almost like a prayer in itself. Tomorrow will be difficult, but God will be with us. That night, as I prayed fervently for Mebratu and his family, for all the Christians who had risked so much to be with me in Eritrea, a sudden sound at the front door stopped me. Before I could move, before I could even get up from the floor, my bedroom door was flung open with such force that it bounced off the wall. 4 men, uniformed and armed with assault rifles, burst into the room. 2 of them pointed their weapons directly at my head, while the other 2 began to quickly search the small space. Tell Hagos, one of them said, his voice as cold as the snow in the mountains. It wasn't a question, it was an order. They knew who I was, an Ethiopian, an illegal herder, infiltrated to subvert the order. I knew what that meant. You're coming with us, he said, his voice firm and emotionless. There was no shouting, no unnecessary violence. It was all very quick, very calculated. They were part of a system that had become masters at silencing any voice that dared to dissent. Like cold surgeons, removing a threat with precision. My hands were handcuffed behind my back so tightly I felt the metal edges cut into my skin. They blindfolded me with a thick cloth and pushed me out of the room. Where is the owner of the house? I asked, anger mixing with concern. He has nothing to do with it, was the reply, a hard blow to my ribs being the only thing that followed. Silence. I didn't know what else to expect. You will speak when ordered, they said, their tone leaving no room for further questions. I was shoved into what appeared to be a military truck. I could feel others being thrown in behind me, but my blindfolds prevented me from seeing. Jonah? Other believers. No one dared say a word. The fear was palpable. The journey seemed endless. Blindfolded, my perception of time was distorted. It could have been minutes or hours, but it felt like an eternity. The truck rocked violently as we passed from paved streets to potholed dirt roads which jolted us against the metal walls, making each second more agonizing. Fear and uncertainty seemed to fill the air, but at the same time, a silent force told me that God was there, even though I could see nothing but darkness. Finally, the truck came to an abrupt stop. I heard shouts of orders, doors opening, and the metallic sound of the gates closing. I was pulled out abruptly, the impact with the ground making me stagger. My legs were numb, a result of the uncomfortable position I'd been in the entire journey. When the blindfold was removed, I had to blink several times to adjust to the blinding light of dawn. I was in a place that resembled a military camp on the outskirts of Asmara. Rows of metal containers stood in the blazing sun, like enormous iron coffins. The smell was unbearable. Hot metal mixed with the stench of human excrement and the unmistakable scent of despair, an odor that seemed almost palpable. I was dragged through a dusty courtyard and led to a grey cement building. The sound of my handcuffs slapping against my body seemed to echo throughout the place. Inside, in a dimly lit corridor, the fluorescent light flickered intermittently, creating a sense of bewilderment. When the handcuffs were removed, I thought I'd finally get some relief, but they quickly handed me a new pair and placed my hands in front of me. Then I was shoved into a room that, though simple, exuded a cold and impersonal atmosphere. It was an interrogation room, a metal table in the center, 2 chairs and a one-way mirror on the wall. Sitting behind the desk was a middle-aged man, dressed in civilian clothes but with the bearing of a seasoned military man. He didn't introduce himself, offer me a glass of water, or ask any questions about my condition. He simply waited for the guard to push me into the chair opposite. And there, in silence, he began. His voice was surprisingly soft, even polite, in stark contrast to the brutality of the moment. Mr. Hagos, he said, consulting a folder in front of him. We know exactly who you are and what you've been doing in our country for the past 6 weeks and 4 days. We have names, dates, and locations. Your network of illegal churches has been completely dismantled. My heart ached, but not for myself. My suffering was nothing compared to what might lie ahead for everyone else. The brothers and sisters who trusted me, who risked everything to hear God's word. For Senait, for Berhane, for those young people just beginning to grow in their faith, for the families who had opened their homes, risking their lives. We have just one question, he continued, slamming his hands on the table in an almost academic manner, like a professor about to present a difficult problem. Who really sent you? What Western organization is funding your espionage operation under the guise of religious activities? The question caught me off guard. That moment, that accusation was so absurd, so far from reality, that I couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. No one sent me, I thought, but the words escaped my mouth before I could stop them. I came because God called me, I said firmly, feeling sincerity welling up in my heart. There are no organizations behind me. No funding from foreign powers, no political agenda. I am a pastor and I have come to strengthen the faith of my brothers and sisters in Christ. Nothing more. The man stared at me for several seconds, as if measuring the veracity of my words. His gaze was piercing, but his expression didn't change. Then finally he smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a cold smile full of disdain. "Mr. Hagos," he said, his tone already knowing the answer. "We both know that answer is unsatisfactory." He leaned forward as if beginning to explain a simple equation to an inattentive student. "These illegal churches you've been visiting are subversion cells. They are used by foreign powers to destabilize the Eritrean state. And you are a foreign agent." With a smooth motion, he removed a photograph from the folder in front of him and slid it across the table. It was a blurry image, clearly taken with a hidden camera, showing one of our clandestine meetings. My heart raced when I recognized Mebratu. There he was with his wife and other believers gathered in a circle as I explained a passage from the Bible. The interrogator looked at me with a cold smile and continued as if it were a simple formality. "We'll give him time to reconsider his position. Perhaps a few days in one of our special accommodations will help him remember the names of his foreign sponsors. And when he's ready to talk, he'll tell us the names of all his local contacts, their locations, their communication networks, everything." It was at that moment that I realized my true ordeal was just beginning. Fear began to tighten my chest, but I tried to remain calm. The last thing I wanted was to betray any of my brothers, and the thought of being forced to give up information about them was tearing me apart. I was dragged from the interrogation room after what seemed like an eternity, and dragged out into the courtyard, now lit by the blazing sun that was beginning to intensely heat the air. The heat was unbearable, but what awaited me was even worse. I followed the guards in silence, my feet dragging the ground, to the row of metal containers. A guard unlocked a heavy padlock and opened the door to one of the containers. The heat that erupted from within was like a physical blow, so intense that I felt myself suffocating. Inside, the air was saturated with humidity, sweat, and despair. The atmosphere was unbearable. The container was about 20 feet long and 8 feet wide, and it was already full. 12 men, all sweaty, exhausted, and silent. Some watched me curiously. Others, already exhausted, didn't even look up. I was shoved inside with force. I stumbled and nearly fell, but a thin, frail hand caught my arm, stopping me from falling. The door closed with a metallic clang that resounded like a final sentence. The sound of the padlock being turned was like the clamor of an immovable prison. "Welcome to the oven," a faint voice said from a dark corner. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I could make out the silhouette of an older man, skin stretched tight over his bones, lips so cracked they bled when he spoke. He smiled wearily, as if accustomed to this kind of suffering. "I'm Abraham," he said hoarsely, "former pastor of a Pentecostal church in Keren. I've been stuck here for 8 months now." Over the next few days, I began to get to know the other prisoners better. Among them were Philmon, a 23-year-old evangelist, arrested while distributing Christian pamphlets to soldiers. Rezene, a 45-year-old deacon who led an underground choir. Kibrom, a simple church member arrested for having Christian literature in his home. And 8 other men, all imprisoned for the same reason, their faith. Some had been there for 6 months, others, like Abraham, for longer. The prison routine was brutally simple, yet immensely difficult. The container was sealed during the day, becoming an oven under the scorching sun. During peak heat, the metal became so hot we couldn't touch it without burning ourselves. We were constantly drenched in sweat, but the water we were given was insufficient to rehydrate our bodies. Sometimes a glass of lukewarm, tasteless water was given to us twice a day, accompanied by a meager ration of stale bread and lentils. Only once every 24 hours. We defecated in a bucket in the corner of the container. This bucket was only emptied every 2 or 3 days, which made the environment even more unbearable, with the stench mixing with the heat. Every 2 days, the interrogations were repeated. They asked me repetitive, unbearable questions, trying to force a reaction. They knew that physical and psychological pressure could break a man, make him betray his own brothers. But even in the darkest hours, something inside me resisted. I couldn't speak. I couldn't betray those outside, struggling just as much. With each passing day, the feeling of despair grew denser, heavier. But despite everything, there was one thing they couldn't take from me: my faith. They could imprison my body, but they could never imprison my spirit. And somewhere deep within the prison, I knew my mission wasn't over yet. With each new day, the interrogation continued relentlessly. They gave me the names of Western organizations, contacts, funding sources, communication networks. But whenever I insisted that I was there solely because of my faith, with no conspiracy behind my presence in Eritrea, the beatings began. They weren't brutal, nor intended to disfigure, but methodical, almost scientific, designed to cause intense pain, but without leaving permanent marks or causing fainting. They were on the soles of my feet, on the sensitive spots, in the uncomfortable positions held for hours on end. "Pastor," the interrogator said in one of these sessions as a guard systematically struck my kidneys, "this can end today. We just need a few names, a few connections. We can even arrange for your deportation to Ethiopia if you cooperate. Think of your wife, your children. Do you want them to grow up without a father just for protecting strangers who used you?" The mention of Selami and my children was like a knife to my heart. The pain of missing them tortured me more than the stabbing pains in my body. As much as I tried to focus on my mission, on my faith, the emotional suffering became increasingly overwhelming. I knew my presence in Eritrea was not God's mistake, but the circumstances began to seem unbearable. Doubt, like a venomous snake, began to creep into my mind, whispering that perhaps I had misinterpreted God's call. How much time had passed? I'd lost count after the third week. The constant heat and incessant sweat had turned the days into a murky haze. My body was visibly weakened. I'd lost so much weight I could count my ribs. My gums bled from dehydration and malnutrition. At night, when the temperature dropped slightly, my body would shiver, not from the cold, but because I no longer had the fat to insulate me from the environment. What tortured me most, however, was not the physical suffering, but the spiritual struggle raging within me. As time passed, doubts multiplied. Perhaps it was my spiritual pride that brought me here. I risked my life, but I also risked the lives of so many other brothers. Selamai, in his last words before my departure, had asked me to think about our children. Would I ever see them again? Would they grow up without their father because of a mission that perhaps wasn't truly from God, but rather the fruit of my own spiritual arrogance? Sometimes between the torpor of wakefulness and sleep, I would hear my children's voices calling to me as if they were only a step away. I would wake with tears drying on my chapped cheeks, feeling more distant from them with each passing moment. The emotional pain seemed as intense as the physical. It was on one of those nights when despair consumed me that Abraham crawled to me. In a voice so weak it was almost lost in the darkness, he began to recite Hebrews 11, the chapter on the heroes of faith. His memory, even weakened by prison conditions, was impressive. He recited up to verse 36 with special emphasis. Others had trial of rebukes and scourgings, yea, moreover of imprisonment and chains. Then he leaned so close that I could feel his warm breath on my ear. He whispered, "Brother Tekle, if you weren't a real threat to the enemy, you wouldn't be here. If your ministry weren't bearing fruit, they wouldn't have stopped you. Your doubts are Satan's last resort to defeat you when chains and heat haven't worked." His words were like cool water to my parched soul. They didn't solve my situation, they didn't quench my heat or thirst, but they gave me the strength to carry on another day. And from then on, I did. One day at a time, sustained by renewed faith and the hope that my mission, however difficult, still had a purpose. That melody, so familiar, seemed to pierce the darkness and envelop me with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. As I sang, my body remained exhausted, but something in my soul was ignited. The memory of Psalm 23, the song my mother sang to me in our darkest moments, brought me a sense of connection to something greater, something beyond pain and suffering. With each word, it seemed the anguish consuming me lessened, a little relief appearing in the shadows. He restores my soul, I repeated to myself, as if affirming that even in the chaos, there was purpose. I wasn't alone. I didn't know how, but something inside me told me God was there in those cold metal walls, in the tears that silently streamed down my face. He was with me. He always was. The other prisoners, exhausted and immersed in their own suffering, began to listen. At first, only one or two raised their heads, then a few more, until the melody softly echoed in the cramped silence of the container. There were no words, no gestures, but there was a presence, a connection that transcended that place of torture. With each repetition of the verse, a feeling of hope arose between us. And when I finished singing, an inexplicable peace washed over me. It wasn't a physical peace, but a peace of mind, a sense that I was in a safe place, even in the midst of hell. That night, I felt that perhaps I wasn't just fighting for my physical survival. Physical suffering, however unbearable, wasn't the only test. There was something deeper, something I hadn't understood before. The test of my faith. Not the comfortable faith, the kind cultivated when everything is going well, but the faith forged in fire. The faith that doesn't give up even when everything seems to be falling apart. In the days that followed, something inside me changed. I still felt the constant pain in my body, the relentless interrogations and the stifling heat. But now there was a new strength in my heart. I was no longer just waiting for physical deliverance. I understood that, even without immediate answers, God was sustaining me, was with us among those prisoners. He had not abandoned us. The next morning, when the guards opened the container door and dragged us in for another interrogation, my attitude had changed. I knew I was faced with a dilemma. Give in to the pressure, betray my brothers and my own faith, or continue resisting whatever the cost. I no longer had the answers they wanted to hear, but my faith was stronger than ever. The interrogations continued, the days dragged on, but now I had a strength I hadn't had before. I didn't know if I would be transferred elsewhere, if my life would end there, but what I did know was that God had given me the courage to carry on. He hadn't abandoned me in the darkness of the container, and He wouldn't abandon me at any other point in my life. And so, as the days passed, I clung even closer to that song from Psalm 23. Remembering those words not only gave me strength to endure, but also a certainty. God restores the soul. With the sound of the door slowly opening, our initial panic gave way to a sense of confusion. Our bodies, weak and exhausted, moved instinctively, as if we feared something more terrible was about to happen. But as the door swung open and the darkness of the night enveloped us, the sight of the empty space before us brought something none of us could have expected: freedom. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate with the gentle breeze that blew through the open door. The scent of the cool night, something so simple yet so distant, filled our nostrils. A chance, an opportunity no one expected. Philemon, his eyes fixed on the opening before us, murmured, almost in disbelief, "God opened the gates like Paul and Silas." There was no more time to think, to question what was happening, or even to marvel at the miracle. The path lay before us, and it was clear, unobstructed. The sound of the guards' boots pounding on the walls and the shouts of silence faded, and the voice of the Lord, which we had heard for so many months only in our hearts, now spoke powerfully, guiding us out of that place of torment. With a nod, we quickly moved one by one toward the opening. Our bodies were still weak, but our spirits were stronger than ever. Liberation was within our grasp, and now the only thing that mattered was moving forward. There was no time for hesitation. Each step we took was a step closer to freedom. Fear, once our constant companion, had vanished. As we walked through the detention camp, we felt the weight of the invisible chains that had previously bound us dissipate. This wasn't a planned escape. It wasn't something we could control. It was simply a miracle, something given to us, a gift directly from God. Our only goal was to leave. There were no plans, no maps. Our only guide was the faith that now burned brighter within us, like a flame that could not be extinguished. Adrenaline mixed with the feeling of experiencing something divine gave us the strength to keep going, even when our bodies screamed for rest. As we approached the fence, our hearts beat faster. Each of us knew the next decision would be crucial. It would be the end of our suffering, but there was also the risk of capture at any moment. The camp lights shining in the distance seemed like a distant illusion, but as we got closer to the fence, we realized there was an opening, a weakness in the security no one had anticipated. Without hesitation, we passed through, one by one. The moment we cleared the fence, we all fell to our knees, not to rest, but to give thanks, to worship. Gratitude washed over our hearts like a wave, for we knew that God had not only freed us physically, but spiritually as well. There was no longer a container, no longer the threat of guards, no longer the suffocating heat or the mental torture that had plagued us for months. Instead, there was freedom and an inexplicable peace. What followed was a silent race through the darkness, unsure of where to go. Only the confidence that God was guiding us, the certainty that He never abandoned us as He had promised. The fear that paralyzes us, the pain that tortures us, and the sense of helplessness we often feel were overcome by God's power. He didn't just open the doors, He gave us the courage to walk through them. We escaped that night, but looking back, we knew that more than escaping a prison, we were experiencing a freedom that transcended anything we had ever known. The unexpected and miraculous liberation didn't just happen at the gates of the detention camp. It continued to unfold as we walked through the darkness, our bodies exhausted, but our hearts filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Abraham, who had barely been able to move days before, now rose with an energy that seemed to defy all explanation. He, the older shepherd, was leading us with renewed conviction, as if he had been renewed by the same invisible hand that had freed us. "Come on, brothers. God has given us a chance," he said, his words full of quiet authority, as if it were a divine command we could not refuse. We staggered out of the container, our eyes blinded by the first natural light we'd seen in months. The full moon, like a silent witness, illuminated the detention camp with a silvery clarity, creating an environment that felt more like a dreamscape than the harsh reality we were in. As our eyes adjusted to the light, the sight before us was indescribable. Not only had our door opened without explanation, but 2 other doors from nearby shipping containers had also been opened. Equally stunned prisoners emerged from their makeshift cells, looking around with a mixture of disbelief and new hope. What had been impossible now seemed possible. The impossible was happening before our eyes. The situation around us was even stranger. The guards, always alert and relentless, were now strangely disorganized. We could see them in the distance, running back and forth, shouting orders that contradicted each other. It seemed as if something had captured their full attention, something important that prevented them from noticing what was happening in front of us. "Look," Rosine whispered, pointing to the northern perimeter. "The fence is damaged." And indeed, a section of the barbed wire fence surrounding us was down, a clear opening, as if someone had cut it on purpose. It was as if an escape route which had never existed before had been opened for us at that very moment, like a predestined path given by God. There was no time to waste. Without hesitation, we began walking toward the opening. We moved in small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, helping each other as most were physically devastated. As if under the protection of an invisible force, the guards remained distracted. Some ran to one part of the camp, others fired shots into the air in another direction, as if nothing important was in their field of vision. It was as if a curtain of confusion had been lifted, a curtain that concealed our escape and allowed us to slip away unnoticed. Of the approximately 30 prisoners who managed to escape that night, 22 made it through the fence before the guards realized what was happening. By this point, we were scattered in the darkness, each group heading in a different direction based on what we knew of the area. Abraham, Philmon, Kibrom and I were the last to leave, standing together, steadfast, knowing our only chance was to act quickly. Abraham, with the experience of having lived longer than any of us, knew where to go. "I know a retired shepherd," he said. "He lives in a small village farther north. We can hide there until we can cross into Ethiopia." It was the kind of hope that gave us the strength to carry on, like a flame that still burned in our hearts. Our escape through Eritrea was an arduous and risky journey. For 3 weeks we walked at night, hiding during the day. We depended on the help of strangers who, risking their own lives, gave us shelter, water and food. Kibrom, however, did not survive. His health, already weakened by imprisonment and lack of medical care, gave way midway through the journey. One night, after a coughing fit so severe he could barely breathe, he lay down to rest and never woke up. The pain of losing Kibrom was profound, but we knew he had given his life for something greater. We buried him under an acacia tree, in an unmarked grave, offering our prayers and promising him that his sacrifice would not be in vain. His memory drove us to continue, to keep moving forward, to never give up. When we finally reached the Ethiopian border in mid-August, I was unrecognizable. I had lost 50 pounds. My body was scarred by dehydration and infections, especially in my kidneys, which would require months of treatment. My physical scars would be visible for a long time, but the emotional scars, the ones that transformed me from the inside out, would be harder to erase. But one thing was certain. Though I returned physically weaker, spiritually, I had returned stronger. What we experienced in that prison, what we endured, was more than a test of human endurance. It was a journey that proved that even in the darkest circumstances, when it seemed all was lost, God was there. And He freed us, not just from physical prisons, but from the prisons of doubt and fear, showing us that even in the darkest nights, His light shines. Spiritually, I had touched the power of God in a way few are privileged to experience. I saw metal doors open without human intervention, blind guards distracted by supernatural confusion, and the power of collective worship create a miracle in the darkest and most desperate place imaginable. When I reflect on everything that happened, it's hard not to see God's hand in every detail, in every step of our journey. If my story touched your heart in any way, if it inspired you, please share it with us. Your comment strengthens us and gives us even more courage to continue sharing these testimonies. However, the story doesn't end with my deliverance. What truly left me speechless, what made me understand even more the depth of the miracle we experienced, was what happened next. About a month after our escape, news began to arrive through refugees crossing the border into Ethiopia. What happened that night, the miracle that transformed the doors of our captivity into doors of freedom, spread quickly, especially among Eritrean Christians. The miracle of the containers, as it became known, became a living legend among Eritrea's underground churches. What for us had been an act of desperation by a group of prisoners on the brink of death became a flame that ignited a spiritual revival in the country's underground churches. But what impressed me even more, what made my heart overflow with joy, was what happened to the guards who were on duty that night. It turned out that 2 of them even converted to Christ. One of them, a young man named Yamane, managed to escape to Sudan 6 months later and told his version of what happened that night. Yamane was on guard duty when it all happened. He told the faithful who helped him in Sudan. When the prisoners started singing, our commander ordered us to intimidate them, to shoot in the air to silence them, but the more we shot, the louder they sang. It was as if they were not afraid of death. I was in shock, and that's when he began to see something he couldn't explain. A light began to shine around the containers. It was a different light than the lights we used, a softer light, but still more intense, more powerful. I thought I was seeing things, that I was hallucinating, but then my guard partner saw it too. We stared at each other, speechless. The strangest thing, according to Yemane, was that the commander and the other guards, as if blind to what was happening, didn't notice anything. They were running around, shouting at each other, giving contradictory orders. It was as if they couldn't see what was happening right before their eyes, he said, a look of disbelief still present in his voice. It was at that moment that Yemane knew something divine was happening. While the guards were in chaos, my partner and I saw the doors of the 3 containers open, one by one, without anyone touching them. The light around the containers seemed to extend all the way to the northern perimeter fence, illuminating a path, and revealed an opening I didn't remember seeing before. Yemane continued, and her words reflected a profound change in her life. I knew in that moment that I was witnessing something supernatural. I had been taught all my life that religion was superstition, that God did not exist. But that night, as I watched those prisoners escape, as I heard their songs of praise echoing in the night, something snapped inside me. The truth struck me like a lightning bolt. The God of those Christians was real, and he had just manifested his power before my eyes. And in the end, Yemane and his fellow guard made no attempt to stop the escape. They stood paralyzed, watching the miracle unfold before them, helpless, because they knew they were facing something they could not control, something beyond human reason. This testimony, this story, is living proof that God's power has no limits. He can act in ways we never imagined, even in the most unlikely places. It wasn't just a miracle of liberation for us prisoners. It was a miracle that touched even the hearts of our guards, transforming lives in ways no one expected. Through this experience, I understood more deeply what it means to have faith in God, to trust him even when circumstances seemed the most impossible. And although I was physically freed from that prison, the true miracle I witnessed was not just my escape. It was the power of God manifesting itself in such a profound way that it changed the destiny of many lives, including the destiny of those who were once my oppressors. If you believe this story can touch the hearts of others, please share it. God's power is still at work, and his wonders know no bounds. Father, he said, his voice trembling with emotion, do you think I could do the same thing someday? Go to a dangerous place to talk about Jesus. This question took me by surprise. I looked at David, my eldest son, only 13, but already possessing a spiritual strength I never imagined I'd see so young. It was as if I were looking at myself when I was younger, full of dreams and the courage to do what seemed impossible. I took a deep breath, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd just asked. I paused for a moment, my mind no longer on the trail before us, but on the memories of the months I'd lived in Eritrea, the suffocating heat of captivity, the worship amidst the pain, and the doors miraculously opened before our eyes. Every part of my story felt alive, pulsing within me again. And without meaning to, Abraham's words in that dark and desperate moment came rushing back. If you weren't a threat to the enemy, you wouldn't be here. I remained silent, trying to articulate a response worthy of everything I had experienced. David, I began, my voice low but firm. If God ever calls you to go to a place like this, then yes, I believe you can go. But most importantly, you need to know that he will strengthen you every step of the way. You will not be alone. He will be with you. In David's eyes, I saw the same flame that years before had driven me to leave the security of my life to follow God's will, even when I didn't know what awaited me. And I knew that by saying those words, I was not only answering his question, but also reaffirming my own faith, the faith that had been forged in adversity, and which now seemed stronger than ever. Our story, which began in such a dark and lost place, was now being spread like light, touching hearts in ways I never imagined. The miracle of the containers was not only a sign of liberation for us, but something that, like a flame lit in a desert, spread and warmed the hearts of many others. Abraham, Philman, and I began sharing our testimony with churches throughout Ethiopia. At first, we were cautious. We knew that even outside Eritrea, there was always the risk of retaliation. The Asmara government had its tentacles in various parts of the world. But we soon realized that keeping what God had done in our lives to ourselves was a way of denying him the glory he deserved. We could no longer remain silent. The accounts of miracles, the light that invaded the darkness, the worship that tore down the walls of oppression, all of this needed to be heard. I remember one of the first times we shared the story in a small church in Addis Ababa. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone's eyes focused on us as we spoke. The people were so attentive, as if waiting for a word of hope to comfort them in their own struggles. When we finished, there was a long silence, as if the power of God still lingered in the room. Then someone began to applaud, and soon everyone was on their feet, praising God. It was at that moment that I understood that the miracle had not been just for us, but for the entire Christian community, for all those who were losing hope, for those who felt forgotten. God not only freed us physically, but also freed them spiritually, bringing revival where before there had been only despair. But, as always happens when God moves powerfully, the questions remain. People began to wonder, What else does God want to do? One of the most impactful questions came from my son David. As we walked along a trail in our town, he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and asked the question that had been echoing in my heart since my release. Dad, do you think I can do that someday? I knew the fire of God had already been lit in his heart, the same fire that burned in my heart when I was his age. And as I looked at him, I felt an indescribable confidence that God was creating something new, something that would be passed down from generation to generation. And so the cycle of faith continued. From my physical and spiritual deliverance to the transformation of an entire country, God's power was moving in ever-widening circles. I knew then that our mission was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. But now, having experienced the true cost of it, I knew my answer wouldn't be easy. A lump tightened my throat, and a whirlwind of emotions fought to escape. Part of me wanted to protect him, to guide him toward a safer, easier path. A life where risks were minimal and worries fewer. But at the same time, there was something inside me that understood deep down that I couldn't stand between him and God's calling. If this was truly Dawood's path, I had no right to stand in his way. So with a heavy heart and tears welling up, I said, "Son, if God calls you, no one can stop you, not even me. But always remember this. It is not our courage that matters, but our obedience. Sometimes the greatest courage we can have is simply saying yes to God, even when the path seems uncertain and dangerous. And that, son, can be the greatest act of faith." I knew I was saying something he would carry with him throughout his life, something that would prepare him for the challenges that would undoubtedly come. But I also knew that God was forming something in Dawood that I couldn't fully comprehend at that moment. He would be a generation that would respond to God's call, just as I had, just as my brothers in faith had. By 2014, 2 years after our escape, the testimony of the songs that opened the iron gates had spread far beyond Ethiopia. I received invitations to share the story at conferences in Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and even Europe. Each time I spoke, I saw the impact on people's hearts, renewed faith, restored hope, and a rekindled commitment to the Great Commission. At a conference in Berlin, a man in his 60s with graying hair and a firm posture approached me. He seemed charged with an experience that transcended words. "Your testimony," he said, his eyes welling with emotion, "reminds me of what we experienced when the Berlin Wall fell." He squeezed my hand tightly, almost as if he wanted to convey his own story. I saw what seemed invincible, regimes that thought they had the power to imprison the human spirit. But all these systems, without exception, collide with the power of God. I saw it then, and I see it in your testimony now. His word touched me deeply. What began as a personal mission, a specific calling from God on my life, became a global testimony. The worship, which began in an Eritrean detention camp, spread like a flame, touching hearts in countries across continents. God's faithfulness amid the fiercest persecution was being proclaimed in every corner of the world. If this testimony is blessing you, please share it on your social media. Every person who hears this story has the chance to be transformed by the power of God. And even as I shared this experience, I knew the true lesson of it all lay in something that transcends the borders of any nation or situation. There were spiritual lessons not just for Christians in closed or persecuted countries, but for all believers who face their own containers in everyday life. Lesson 1. The power of worship transcends circumstances. I remember how, on the night we began singing Psalm 23, I was at my lowest point, physically, emotionally, spiritually. I was weak, exhausted, and without strength. Worship wasn't a strategy nor a desperate attempt to summon a miracle. I wasn't singing hoping something would happen. I was singing because it was the only thing I had left. It was my final act of faith when there was nothing left to lose. And it was in that moment, in my desperation, in the deep silence of the night, that worship became something so much more than words. I was no longer praising God for what He could do for me, but simply for who He is. How many of us place conditions on our worship? How many wait for circumstances to improve before surrendering to God? I will praise you when my health returns. I will worship you when my marriage is restored. I will sing your praises when I finally get that job. But true worship, the kind that moves God's hands, is born in the furnaces of affliction, when all the signs tell us to curse, but we choose to bless. Worship in the midst of pain is not an act of feigning happiness, but a declaration of trust in God, even when the circumstances around us say otherwise. Worship that changes realities is the worship offered when all seems lost, when life has no meaning, when suffering is unbearable. And yet, it is at this moment that the iron doors begin to open. God reveals Himself not as someone who acts only in good times, but as the sovereign Lord who is present in every moment. Job understood this when he said, "Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him." David understood this when he danced before the ark, despite ridicule. Paul and Silas demonstrated this by singing at midnight with their feet in the stocks. And that night in Eritrea, a group of dying men and women experienced this. Worship is not a response to blessings. It is an act of faith regardless of circumstances. No matter how fragile or broken you are, what matters is that even in the midst of pain, you choose to trust God and worship Him. It's not about expecting something from God, but about recognizing who He is, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart. True worship happens when we have nothing left to offer but our trust in God, when words become the last breath of faith in a sea of uncertainty. Worship doesn't depend on being in a good moment or having everything under control. True worship is a choice, a heartfelt surrender, a yes given to God, even when we don't understand what's happening around us. Second lesson: God uses what the world considers weakness to manifest His power. When the guards heard our singing that night, they probably laughed at us. What could they possibly see in those feeble voices of dying, exhausted men? Surely they thought it was a pathetic weapon, a last-ditch effort by desperate prisoners. But what the world would consider weakness, God used as a catalyst for a miracle. What seemed like defeat to human eyes was the very moment God's power manifested. Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My power is made perfect in weakness." And it's true. We don't need to be strong, eloquent, or influential to be used by God. Often, it's precisely in our moments of greatest weakness that He chooses to display His power in the most glorious ways. What we truly have is our willingness to be used, and God can do much with that. Look at the great men and women of the Bible. Moses, a stutterer; Gideon, the youngest of his family; David, a simple shepherd; the disciples, uneducated fishermen. Nothing except their willingness to obey God. And that was more than enough for God to use their lives to change history. If you feel weak, small, or insignificant, know that it is precisely under these conditions that God can work the greatest miracle in your life. Lesson 3. God's miracles are not just for our personal deliverance, but to impact entire communities. If the miracle of our deliverance had been just for us, it would have been extraordinary. But God has a much greater purpose. He doesn't free us just for our own good, but so that we can be a blessing to others. When He takes us out of a difficult situation, it's not just to restore our peace, but to use us to inspire, strengthen, and transform the lives of others. The miracle of our escape from prison wasn't just for our release. It was meant to strengthen the persecuted church in Eritrea, to touch the hearts of guards and officers, to create a movement that would reverberate throughout the region. You may be asking God to solve a personal problem, which is fine, but perhaps He wants to use your situation, your testimony, your liberation for a much greater purpose. Sometimes our pain, our metal container, isn't just about our own trial. It can be the stage God has chosen to display His glory to many others. Suffering, though painful, is never wasted in God's hands. He always has a greater purpose than we can initially see. What you are experiencing today may be part of God's plan to impact many others around you. Fourth lesson: in the kingdom of God, closed doors are not obstacles, they are opportunities. Every sealed door, every seemingly impenetrable barrier, every impossible situation in our lives is actually an invitation for God to reveal Himself. In Revelation 3:8, He tells us, "See, I have set before you an open door that no one can shut." When we face a closed door, an incurable disease, a hopeless marriage, an addiction that seems unmanageable, a financial situation with no way out, we need to remember, to God these doors are not barriers but opportunities. Every closed door is just a chance for God to show who He truly is. The Red Sea seemed impassable until Moses raised his staff. The walls of Jericho were impenetrable until the trumpet sounded. The stone of the tomb seemed immovable until the resurrection morning. And those steel doors on the Eritrean shipping containers seemed impossible to open until we began to sing. What you're facing today may seem like a closed door, an insurmountable obstacle. But if you surrender to God, if you trust Him, He can use this barrier to reveal His glory in ways you never imagined. Don't give up when faced with closed doors. They can be the opportunity God has prepared for His power to manifest in your life. Fifth lesson: the community of faith is essential in times of trial. That night in Eritrea, I didn't sing alone. If I had, my voice would likely have been lost in the vastness of the darkness that surrounded us. It was when Abraham began to sing, then Philmo joined us, and soon other prisoners joined in, that our voices became a powerful, almost irresistible chorus. Together, we were more than a group of prisoners. We were an army of faith. Worship that night was no longer an individual endeavor. It was a union of hearts that, as one body, cried out to God. In your moments of personal struggle, don't isolate yourself. Seek the company of other believers. There is something unique and special when the voices of many unite in prayer and praise. Matthew 18:20 says, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." The enemy will always try to isolate us, to convince us that no one can understand the pain we feel. But the truth is, we were not made to struggle alone. When one member of the body suffers, we all feel it. No matter what your struggle, know that there is strength in the unity of believers. Share your burden and allow others to join you in prayer. If there's something in your life that you need to surrender to God, don't wait any longer. The community of faith is a gift God has given us to support us, to be a source of strength and encouragement. Together, we can face trials with our heads held high. Lesson 6. Your prison can become your pulpit. What the Eritrean government intended to be a place of suffering and eventually a tomb for me, God transformed into a platform of witness. That prison became the pulpit from which God's name was glorified in a way that could never have happened anywhere else. I remember Joseph when he said to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." You may be facing your own prison today, whether it's a devastating loss, a frightening medical diagnosis, a betrayal that left you broken, or a failure that seems to have defined your life. But what the enemy or circumstances intend for evil, God can turn into something good. The very place of pain, suffering, and regret can become the setting for a testimony that glorifies God. Remember men like John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, one of the most powerful works of Christian literature, while imprisoned. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote some of his most profound works from a Nazi concentration camp. Corrie ten Boom found her global ministry after surviving the Ravensbrück concentration camp. All of them witnessed how God can transform the darkest circumstances into platforms for His power. No matter what your metal vessel is today, God can use it as a platform to reveal His glory. Your prison can become the pulpit that will inspire others, bring healing, and be a beacon of hope to those still in darkness. Finally, I want to say something to you, my brother, my sister. It's no coincidence that you're hearing this story. God has allowed it to reach your ears because there's something specific He wants to speak to you about today. Perhaps you're in your own metal vessel. Perhaps the heat of your problems is consuming you day after day. Whether it's anxiety, depression, addiction, illness, loneliness, financial despair, or fear of the future. They're different vessels but equally suffocating. But I want to encourage you with a truth I learned so profoundly that night. The same God who opened the sealed metal doors can loosen the chains that hold you captive. The same Jesus who blinded the gods and prevented them from seeing our escape can remove the blindfolds from the eyes of your loved ones who don't yet know Him. The same Spirit who inspired our worship songs in the darkness can give you a new song, even in your darkest night. But there's something you need to do. Whatever is holding you captive, whatever is suffocating you, you need to surrender it to God. You need to trust in His power, not just to transform your circumstances, but to transform your life. The story I share with you isn't about a miraculous escape or what God did in a specific moment. It's about what God can do in any situation, at any time, if we surrender to Him. If you're in a place of pain, suffering, or imprisonment, know that you're not alone. God is with you, and He can transform your pain into something powerful. He can open doors you think are irrevocably closed. He can perform miracles in your life because He is the same God yesterday, today, and forever. So I invite you to take this step of faith, to trust in this God who opened iron doors and performed miracles in the midst of darkness. He can do the same for you. You need to start singing in your darkness. Yes, you need to raise your voice in praise, even when everything around you tells you to remain silent. When despair, pain, or fear try to silence you, it is at that moment that your voice, however weak, can be the most powerful act of faith you have. Worship God not for what He can do, but for who He is. Because when you worship with a sincere heart, when you surrender completely to His power and sovereignty, He always responds, not necessarily with a visible or instant miracle, but in a way that will be perfect for your situation, because He knows your heart. If after hearing this testimony you still have doubts, if you still question whether Jesus is real, whether He can transform your life and give you new hope, then I tell you with all my heart, you don't need any more evidence. The same Jesus who opened sealed metal doors in Eritrea, the same who converted gods who once persecuted us, the same who brought revival to an entire nation is touching your heart now, in this moment. Are you ready to make the most important decision of your life? Are you ready to leave the spiritual prison you find yourself in and enter the freedom that only Christ can offer? If so, then repeat this prayer with me, with all your heart. Lord Jesus, I acknowledge that I am a sinner and that I need your forgiveness. I believe that you died on the cross for my sins and rose again to give me eternal life. I ask you to come into my heart, to be the Lord of my life, and to transform me completely. I renounce my past life and accept the new life you offer me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for the miracle you will perform in my life. In your name, amen. If you prayed this prayer sincerely, congratulations. You have just been born again. You have escaped the spiritual shell that held you captive. Right now, the angels in heaven are celebrating your decision. Your new life in Christ has begun. And this is just the beginning of a wonderful journey. Now begins the phase of growth and strengthening, and it's vital that you surround yourself with people who will help you walk firmly in faith. We want to be with you through this process. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This is a simple way to stay connected to messages, testimonies, and teachings that will nourish your spiritual life week after week. You can also share this video with your friends and family. You never know who might need to hear it right now. Sometimes a simple shared link can be the beginning of a major transformation in someone's life. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're from, if this testimony touched your life, or if you took the first step on your journey with Christ. If you're facing difficulties or have an important decision to make, we want to pray for you. Each message is read and prayed over because we want to accompany you. If you're facing a difficult situation, whether it's a decision to follow Christ or a struggle that needs prayer, know that you're not alone. Remember, you were not called to walk alone. The community of faith is a gift from God to encourage you, correct you when necessary, and celebrate with you the victories He will bring. And with every step you take, we will be here, praying for you, accompanying your journey, and celebrating your walk with Christ. Also, dedicate time each day to the Bible and prayer. These moments are crucial to growing in your faith and understanding more deeply who Jesus is. Start with the Gospels, where He reveals His heart and His mission. The Word of God will be the daily nourishment that sustains your soul, and prayer will be your direct connection with the Father. Be sure to set aside time to surrender to this personal relationship with God. Remember that the Christian life is a daily journey built on intimacy with the Lord, and do not keep silent what God has done for you. Your testimony, no matter how small, has power. Sharing what God has done in your life can be the seed that begins to transform another person's heart. You may feel small, but the testimony of a single believer can spark a movement of faith capable of touching lives around the world. As I conclude this testimony, I cannot help but be moved to tears as I remember all that God has done since that night in July 2012 when I was in a detention camp in Eritrea. It's been years since I heard the unearthly sound of locks opening without human intervention. Every day, I continue to discover new dimensions of this miracle. What happened that night didn't just change my life. It changed the lives of many, including guards who were once persecutors but became followers of Christ. He not only freed me and my fellow prisoners, but sparked a revival that still burns in one of the most closed-off nations in the world. He not only rescued me from certain death, but also gave me a testimony that has impacted thousands of people across continents. But the most beautiful thing of all is that the power that operated in that place is available to you too. The same God who opened sealed metal doors is willing to open the doors that hold you captive today. The same Jesus who transformed a detention camp into a stage for His glory wants to transform your impossible situation into a testament to His power. No matter how hermetic your container, no matter how secure your prison, no matter how impossible your situation seems, songs of praise in the darkness remain a weapon that hell cannot resist. Then, lift your head, brother. Lift your head, sister. Your God is not finished with you. Your story doesn't end in prison. It ends in victory. Your vessel will not be your tomb, but rather the stage for your testimony. May the God who opens closed doors bless you and keep you. May He make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May He lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Always remember, there is no lock that His love cannot open.